Good afternoon, attendees of this colloquium. I am Abigail Payne, the Ronald Henderson Professor and Director of the Melbourne Institute, Applied Economic and Social Research in the Faculty of Business and Economics. Let me extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you. Let me also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present here today. Today's colloquium features research undertaken by my colleague, Professor John Deneau, on financial well-being. Part of this work has been in collaboration with the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. These colloquia replace our normal face-to-face forums and workshops. Our goal is to provide insights through the lens of Melbourne Institute researchers and to engage with you so we can better understand Australian economic and social policy. John Deneau is a professorial research fellow. His research interests include topics in education, health, employment, and financial well-being. He has been at the Melbourne Institute since 2011. He received his doctorate degree in 1995 at the University of Munich in Germany. John will speak for approximately 20 minutes. We will also be joined by Mr. Mohammed Khalil from the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. He will speak briefly to provide his insights and reactions to the presentation. This will be followed by a question and answer session with both speakers. Mo is the general manager of the group Financial Wellbeing. He leads a multidisciplinary team of behavioral, data, digital, and experimental scientists developing innovative capabilities and experiences that improve financial well-being. Mo, with a background in financial services management consulting, has delivered award-winning digital strategies and innovations at startups and other major financial service institutions. Let me remind you of a few housekeeping matters for this colloquium. It is being recorded. To handle questions and comments, we are relying on the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen for those of you who are using Zoom. For those of you using Slido, you can submit questions in the box on the right-hand side of your screen. You can submit questions at any time through these functions. Please join me in welcoming John Deneau.
Oh, thanks very much, Abigail. Just wait for the video to come on. Can everyone see me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. I'll just share screen. Okay, wonderful. I'll just put into, there we go. Okay, well, thanks very much, Abigail. So a big welcome to everyone who's tuning in from all around the world. Today we'll have a look at some the most recent insights that we've gained in financial well-being in Australia. And as Abigail mentioned, some of this work has been in collaboration with the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. And so we've had access to some of the summary data that the Commonwealth Bank produces, and so that's part of the basis for our research. So anyway, welcome, and strap yourselves in for an interesting story. So it's very clear we're living in some very, very interesting times right now. So after nearly 3 decades of continuous growth in Australia, all of a sudden we're now dealing with dramatic turbulence in our labor market. We're looking at record rates of unemployment, unemployment rates, negative growth, underemployment, underutilization. So we're looking at some fairly high turbulence. And normally when we're looking at how the economy is doing, we're looking at some hard indicators, such as the amount of income, labor income that people are earning, et cetera. But while we can measure that typically fairly well, we can look at people's tax returns, or we can ask them how much they make. What we don't really observe typically too well is how people are, for instance, living within their means, living within that income level. And what we're seeing now, obviously, is this is obviously a huge topic, is the extent to which people are financially overextended, especially in this very turbulent time. And have people sort of, sort of like the squirrel, have they got buffer stocks for some unexpected events like the COVID crisis? And are their futures secure? So that's kind of the research question that we're looking at here, is not so much the amount of money that people have, but the extent, or the extent to which they're living within their means. So all of these questions about living within your means can be asked of people who have high and low levels of income. And so that's useful to know. It's not so much that we're asking about income, we're asking about how well you live within your means. So we're interested in finding out how financial well-being, the extent to which you're living within your means, is developing over time, especially most recently, and not just simply so much how much income have you got. We want to know how well you're coping. So let's start off by first defining what we mean by financial well-being. And we define financial well-being as the extent to which people both perceive and have financial outcomes in which they meet their financial obligations, financial freedom to make those choices that allow them to enjoy life. There's perfect freedom there. Control their finances, and the extent to which they have and perceive financial security. And this is important. We have 3 different time dimensions. It's the extent to which they have this financial well-being now, in the future, and under possible unforeseen adverse circumstances. So the definition of financial well-being is it's defined in terms of financial outcomes that people experience, rather than just all the conditions and characteristics and vectors of information that might be attributed to those outcomes. And so what I mean by that is that there's a trade-off between including information like income into the measure of financial well-being itself. And we're not going to do that. And the idea is that we want to keep household income separate from our definition of financial well-being, because we want to analyze financial well-being whilst controlling for income. And so it makes sense if you think about it in this particular manner, is that some people can have high levels of income and yet not be living very well within their means. In contrast, people could have lower levels of income, but be dealing very well with that, buffering for unforeseen events and dealing with their day-to-day expenses in a very responsible manner. So it's not about the level of income; it's how you're dealing with this income that we're interested in. So how do we measure financial well-being? Well, we measure financial well-being in a 2-pronged attack. We measure financial well-being using bank record data, and that's part of the data that we've received from the Commonwealth Bank, and also survey data that we get from survey participants, and we ask them how they're doing, how they're responding to shocks in the labor market. And we've normalized the scales to be on a 0 to a 100 scale, 0 being very low financial well-being and 100 being high financial well-being. So because we're looking at different data sources, we actually have 2 different measures of financial well-being. So we've got the observed financial well-being scale, which we can generate automatically from bank record data. And then what we do is we summarize the bank record data in such that we aggregate over actually several million bank customers, and we have some summary measures as to what's going on. And with the survey data, we have reported financial well-being, And people self-report and tell us about, for instance, their income levels or their employment status, et cetera. And they also tell us about the extent to which they're living within their means. And so this is all sort of anonymous responses. So in total, all of the analysis will be completely anonymized. So having a look at the observed financial well-being scale coming from the bank account data, what we're interested in is 5 main questions. And we're generating this data automatically from the bank accounts themselves. So for instance, we generate 5 subcomponents of our financial well-being scale. And they would be, for instance, days in the last year during which the customer had the ability to raise 1 or 3 months expenses from savings or available credit, days in the last year with low liquid balances, age normed residual of customers' median savings balance. That means, given your age, does your savings balance pan out? Months in the last year when your spending exceeded 80% of inflows. So are you managing your expenses? Payment problems in the last year. And so we've got a different sliding scale from 0 to 3 or 0 to 4 for these. We sum up all of these 5 indicators, and then we multiply by a constant factor, and we can get a scale from 0 to 10. That provides us the observed financial well-being scale. We also create a scale called the reported financial well-being scale. As I mentioned, it's from survey data, it's self-assessed, and people answer responding to their own sort of life situation. They answer on a sort of also on a sliding scale, a Likert scale. For instance, responding to the question, I can enjoy life because of the way I'm managing my money, not at all to completely. And also I can handle a major unexpected expense. The extent to which I feel on top of my day-to-day finances, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. I'm comfortable with my current level of spending relative to the funds that are coming in. I'm on track to have enough money to provide for my financial needs in the future. So you can see that it's about how you deal with money. It's not the level of money. So all of these combined, we add them up. On each component has a 0 to 4 component. We add them up, we multiply by a standard factor, and we get the 0 to 100 scale. So we have to keep in mind the context of what's going on, especially in the last 6 to 8 months. So due to COVID-19, we're experiencing a massive drop in employment numbers, increased unemployment, increase in the unemployment rate, increase in the underutilization rate, drop in hours worked, a historic level of people who are Googling the term Centrelink. So in the terms of that backdrop, what is it that we're observing with financial well-being? Well, this will be very interesting for you. This is the time series that we have for financial well-being, the overall observed financial well-being scale. And you can see that starting from about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, we can see that financial well-being is sort of slowly moving downwards. And then starting from February and March of this year, when COVID started to kick in, the crisis started, our financial well-being is moving up dramatically. Now, to do any analysis on this type of data, the first thing that you realize, all the time series guys would immediately look at this and say, whoa, this time series is clearly not stationary. So the very first thing that we'll need to do is make this into a stationary series. And the reason is that as soon as your data is not stationary, any of the results that you would get out of that would be completely spurious, misleading. So the very first thing that we're going to need to do is transform that data into something that's going to be stationary. And by stationary, what I mean is you can see that this series is now sort of centered around 0. It's moving in a manner such that it's not sort of exploding off into into space or going down into the basement. It's sort of moving around around the 0 line, and that's going to be really, really important to do any analysis. So the way in which we do that, we just simply log the financial well-being to smooth it out. And then we take the first difference, which is just simply T minus 1, sort of today minus tomorrow's. And so we get the changes. So that allows us to even start the analysis. Now, I mentioned that there are 5 different component parts, and I'm going to talk to the 5 different component parts of the overall observed financial well-being measure. And I really want to sort of focus on, for instance, this particular component, and this is the net spend score. And so what you can see is that starting in February, March, some of these components start to rise dramatically. And that's actually what the basis of the analysis is today. We're interested in why is this financial well-being improving since the start of the COVID crisis. Okay, so in order to do that, what we're going to do is a little bit of sort of technical analysis here using time series analysis. I won't go into too much detail, but just to give enough detail for the time series buffs. What we're doing here is we have a system of 5 equations, 1 equation for each one of the component parts of the observed financial well-being scale. And what we're doing is we're running a global vector autoregression, a GVAR. And the idea being is that each one of these component parts is interrelated, of course, to every other part. And so what we're doing is we're running a regression on each one of these individual financial well-being scales, but we of course transform it in the same way to make it stationary. We run a regression and we run a regression on the lagged value and this global variable, which is the overall financial well-being scale, but minus the individual component for that subcomponent. And the idea being is that we can connect the 5 different component parts through the extent to which they're just simply a component of the overall index. But what we're really interested in finding out is the extent to which some hard economic variables, like the Melbourne Institute Westpac Consumer Sentiment Index or the Melbourne Institute Westpac Unemployment Expectations Index, are playing a role. So we'd like to see, for instance, how consumer sentiment is impacting on financial well-being and also unemployment expectations impacting on financial well-being. And that's going to be the basis of the So very, very interesting. This is a sort of a summary of the most interesting results. I have quite a few other results which I won't have time to show you here, but I can talk to in the question period. One of the things that we find is that the role of the consumer sentiment index on the net score, the net spend score is clearly negative. And what we see is that as consumer sentiment rises, we see that people would be spending more and more. And then their financial well-being net spend score would be dropping because as people spend more and more and more, they have less reserves. Well, actually what we've been seeing is in the reverse. We've been seeing consumer sentiment dropping over this time period. And so we can see that it's the reverse relationship. Now, what we can see is that, for instance, with a one unit change in the consumer sentiment index, what we're seeing is about a 0.3 drop in financial well-being. Of course, in the reverse, if the consumer sentiment index decreases, then we would see exactly the reverse and an improvement. Now, that's from its magnitude, that's a sort of a medium-sized coefficient, a medium-sized effect. And we can see that, for instance, this is this component here. So as consumer sentiment would be increasing, that would be dropping. Because consumer sentiment is dropping, that's increasing. What's really kind of the focus of the analysis here today is the extent to which unemployment expectations are impacting on the net spend score. So what we're seeing is that unemployment expectations are rising dramatically. So as the COVID crisis kicks in, we see unemployment expectations really rising dramatically, and people are quite nervous. They're not spending as much, and so they have a lot more buffers left because they're not spending as much. That means that their net spend score in financial well-being is improving. Okay, so it's a bit of a maybe at the surface a counterintuitive response, but what's really going on is that people are not spending as much, and that's where all the action is. So people are not spending as much. They have quite a bit left over in terms of buffer. And why is it that they have this left over in terms of buffer? Well, it's precautionary savings. So really what's going on is as this COVID crisis has kicked in, what we're seeing is a dramatic increase in precautionary savings. So that's really the story as to what's going on in terms of the financial well-being index as observed from people's bank accounts. They're saving in anticipation of some bad times ahead. So like I said, in the backdrop, this increase in unemployment, drop in employment, increase in the unemployment rate, underutilization rate going through the roof, people being very, very worried and thinking about, how do I get myself signed up for Centrelink and effectively welfare payments. Well, what's going on at that same time with precautionary savings? Well, funny you should ask, because Barbara Broadway and I at the Institute have just recently published a paper where we looked at the role of subjective economic expectations and looked at how people responded in times of economic turbulence with respect to precautionary savings. We did this analysis for the global financial crisis. It was published last year in 2019. This actually has some very, very interesting insights for what's going on now with precautionary savings. Let me read that. Some of the key points from the paper. For the first time, the study analyzes whether such precautionary savings related household behavior can be triggered by a crisis such as the Great Recession. We're seeing this now in real time. We find that on average, 1.5% of a household's yearly income is used towards precautionary savings. We show that a substantial increase in subjective economic uncertainty impacts substantially on real economic savings behavior. It's exactly what we're seeing. Increasing the cash savings rate by 1.1 percentage points, or almost double, that's what we're seeing now. This effect of subjective uncertainty comes above and beyond that of objective uncertainty. So there's some sort of overshooting that goes on as well. This provides evidence that households accrue savings as a result of the mere perception of economic uncertainty over and above the actual experience of that economic uncertainty. So we're now seeing very high levels of economic uncertainty, and then over and above that, there's going to be a perception effect as well. So it's going to be a double effect. So any analysis that is focused on objective or subjective measures alone, or that assumes responsiveness to uncertainty to be constant over time, cannot uncover the strong overshooting in household savings behavior after a crisis. And that's exactly what we're picking up. Okay, that was the macro level analysis. Let's have a look at the micro level analysis. And all of this is based on survey data. So we ran a survey April through July of this year. It was only a quick 10-minute survey that we did online. And we managed to get more than 2,000 Australian respondents. We've done all the population weights such that it would be representative of the Australian public by age and gender. And we use a short form version of the Melbourne Institute reported financial well-being scale that has 5 items in it. And so what we ask people is to find out the extent to which COVID is impacting on them through the labor market. What we asked the question was, regarding the worldwide coronavirus pandemic, blah, 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 because of COVID-19, since December 1st, 2019, have you experienced any of the following? Reduced work hours, reduced salary, loss of employment, or having to file for unemployment benefits or insurance or assistance? So here we pick up those types of things, and we pick up at somewhere like between 30 and 35% of people who are responding to this. So there's quite a few. There's a large percentage of the Australian population that's being affected by this, and what we see is that for those who are affected, we see an associated drop in financial well-being on the 0 to 100 scale of 18 points. So if you've lost your job, if you've had reduced work hours, if you've had reduced salary because of COVID-19, you have an 18-point lower financial well-being on that 0 to 100 scale. That's a very large effect, but that's an effect on average. What's really interesting is also to see across the distribution. So if you are already having high levels of financial well-being, that drop would be much, much lower. That drop would only be about 8 points. You'd still be affected, but it wouldn't be very, very large. However, if you were already having serious issues with financial well-being, you had very low financial well-being, and you were hit then again with COVID, you would have something like 28 points lower financial well-being than if you were not affected. So it's really, really a dramatic change in what's going on with financial well-being and being affected by COVID. So what we can conclude is that both looking at the bank account related data, the observed financial well-being, what we can see is that there were strong changes in behavior starting in February, March of this year. And that perfectly coincides with the COVID-19 crisis. What we see is expectations of unemployment increasing. We're seeing in response to that, of course, a forced reduction in spending, a precautionary savings activity that's going on, which of course, it initially is a good thing. People recognize that they will need those buffers. So their precautionary savings has increased in anticipation of some potentially bad things to come. But those buffers are being accrued. So on the other side, what we're seeing from the reported financial well-being, the survey-based scale, is that there are very, very strong associations between what's going on with being affected by COVID, something like 30% of the respondents, the adult respondents, and significant drops in financial well-being, somewhere in the area of on average 18 points, but between 8 and 28 points, depending on where you were already in the financial well-being distribution. So the thing is that all of these things are going on all at once. Both of these measures are really important to understand what we're picking up in the bank accounts, what we're picking up instantly as people are changing their expectations about things coming ahead in terms of the economic situation. So that's really the overarching story of what's going on in financial well-being, both at the observed level coming from bank accounts and also the self-assessed reported financial well-being coming from survey data. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, John. So we're going to ask a couple questions before we turn to Mohammed. And let me remind viewers that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to write in questions, or if you're using Slido, the right-hand side of your screen. So John, the first question I have is really kind of a question I have around interpretation.
Yeah.
So in your measure of financial well-being, you mentioned that it's really trying to capture living within means. What's the relationship between financial well-being and what we might think of as financial stress?
Okay, let me just go back to sharing the screen. And so financial well-being as we've operationalized it from the indicators coming off the bank accounts, you can see the extent to which financial well-being is covering your ability to live within your means. And it's operationalized in very specific ways. So whether you could, you know, raise 1 month's expenses at the sort of at the drop of a hat, if for something were unforeseen, or the extent to which on a daily basis your balances are very low in your bank account. You're sort of hemorrhaging money out of your bank account. So it's looking at well-being as an overarching concept, and each one of these components addresses one of these components in the overarching concept. And so if we go back to the definition of financial well-being, that's what we're picking up. So it doesn't necessarily have to be stress. I mean, there could be very positive concepts being captured there. You know, the freedom to make choices, the extent to which you're planning ahead for the future. So it's not necessarily focusing on stress. It's the overall distribution of your financial situation.
Okay, great. Thank you. And hopefully a quick answer so we can get to Mohammed.
Yeah.
My second question is from one of our listeners. Is not the drop in expenditure under COVID partly due to an increase in precautionary savings, but also partly due to regulations restricting consumption choices?
Totally.
If so, isn't it a bit confounding in terms of having a mixture of effects?
So what we analyze here is two of the main sort of macroeconomic indicators, you know, like the unemployment expectations, et cetera. So what we're just showing is the two main effects. Of course, we could add additional macroeconomic indicators to try to pick up some of those additional, you know, changes in regulation, et cetera. You're completely right. I mean, people just simply haven't been able to spend. You can't go to the hairdresser, you can't go to the restaurant, you can't go to all these places. But the problem that we currently have is this is only 2 years of data, one data point for each month. So we have a limited number of control variables that we can add in at this point.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, John. Let me now turn to Mohammed Khalil, who will spend a few minutes giving us his reactions and thoughts on that.
Great, thank you. It's honestly been a privilege for the Commonwealth Bank to work so closely with John and the Melbourne Institute to develop these measures, and it really is fulfilling to sort of see the purpose for which we've developed these, which is to provide the community with greater insights into the state of financial well-being, the drivers, and ways that we might potentially want to think about responding. So really excited to see these insights. I think they're hopefully of value to this community. We've shared them with other communities that we believe would get value out of this. So whether it's community partners as well as government stakeholders. You know, my thought is that, you know, for those of you out there who are doing research in this space, please continue to do so. We are tracking and monitoring it. We are using it to inform our thinking. And hopefully you will have seen many of the features and experiences that we've deployed, beginning to try to address some of these impacts on financial well-being that we're seeing as part of this pandemic. And it is certainly going to be a continued focus for the group. So, you know, I don't have any meaningful insight or technical thing to add here. I think I'll leave that to John as the expert. But we're certainly not only hopefully a supporter of this, but a very strong consumer of these types of insights.
Great. Thank you, Mo. So
Excellent.
Now we're going to ask, I'm going to ask questions of both of you. So please feel free to answer. Mo, I think you're being a little bit modest in terms of your own insights. Next question is, if people have massively increased precautionary savings due to COVID, does this mean that the recent government tax cuts will be less effective in increasing spending and jumpstarting the economy?
I can jump in on that one. Yeah, I think that across the board, people understand that there are potentially some dangerous times ahead. Sort of the JobKeeper, job seeker programs are being scaled back. The extent to which government support is going to be continuing is a bit uncertain. And so I think that people are understanding that they're needing to be saving a lot more. And I think that tax cuts are probably going to have less of a stimulus than one might have in otherwise sort of normal conditions. So I think, yes, that would be certainly an effect. Mo, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think that's right. We're going to continue to sort of monitor the state of well-being, but as you saw in the data you showed, people are clawing back on spending.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be a really important tension for the government and ourselves to help consumers manage is being resilient for the future while also trying to ensure that we have a successful economy restart.
And I think the thing that we shouldn't forget is, given the very, very high level of the casualization of our workforce, so if people are not working, they're not earning. And we have to keep that in mind. If they're not earning, they're probably not spending as well, or they're scaling that back. So that effect, I think, is sort of affecting Australia even stronger than other countries.
Okay, great. Now I have kind of two technical questions, or the two questions that are on the same theme of a technical question. These financial well-being scales and what you've been doing in your work, are you doing this at the individual level or the household level? And so if it's at the individual level, the question is, how do you take into account that there may be differences depending upon household size and other constraints?
Yeah, maybe I'll start this off. Mo can speak to this as well. Yeah, so all of this analysis is done at the individual level, and in our survey, we only looked at the individual. What's interesting is that coming up in the Melbourne Institute's Hilda household panel survey is that we have a 5-item financial well-being scale that's been implemented in one of the coming waves, and so we'll be able to look at that within a household context. The bank account information that I'm using is just aggregated, so it's actually it's taken from individuals' bank accounts information, but it's aggregated up. So it's aggregated up into a time series. So it's aggregated up by 5,000 or 5 million individuals. But the CBA has access to the individual data of all their clients, and of course that can also be looked at by CBA.
Okay, great. And now I'm going to start with a couple questions in terms of trying to understand things a little bit more deeply. So one thing we know is that COVID has affected different regions and different industries across Australia. I know those of us in Melbourne think that everyone's in lockdown. We know that's not the case.
Yeah.
So the question is, have you been able to use the data to discern, whether there are differences in the correlations between the measures of financial well-being and the precautionary savings hypothesis you've been presenting?
So I guess because we've got two different levels of data, there's not a lot of additional information, for instance, from the CBA data about which industry or occupation that the respondents are in. I pick up some of that information in the reported financial well-being measure from the survey, and I look at people's occupations. And so there is some variation by occupation. And so one would expect that, laborers and, sort of white collar, lower level white collar workers are just simply being hit more by COVID. Now, the precautionary savings question was not asked in the survey data. So it was only a 10-minute survey it's all done online. So we had to be very, very succinct about the types of questions that we were asking. But the precautionary savings effect is coming through in the macro data. Did you want to mention anything, Mo, or is that okay?
No, I think that's right. I mean,
Yeah.
I think when it comes to industry level impact, we have other insights that we generate at CBA. So our chief economist, Stephen Helmerich, does produce a spending insights report of which parts of which are available publicly. I think watch this space. There may be an ability for us to try to connect the two over time, but we're not there just yet.
Yeah. And so you don't want to share any of those insights with the readers right now. Okay, so my next question is really kind of wanting you to look a bit into the crystal ball. So what are your expectations in let's say 9 to 12 months from now? In two scenarios, 9 to 12 months from now, there is a vaccine that is readily available and people are taking it up. 9 to 12 months from now, there is no vaccine yet. Still optimistic that there will be one, but we're still having to undertake a fair degree of restrictions, even if we are moving around reasonably freely. What do you think the impact on financial well-being is going to be?
Do you want to start that one off, Mo? I can as well, whichever. Do you want me to go?
Yeah, why don't you go first, and then
Okay.
I'll see if I can add anything.
Yeah, so I think the real lesson, for instance, from the global financial crisis was the extent to which precautionary savings played a role. And so the thing is that in Australia we have a concept of unemployment assistance. In other words, a base level, the Centrelink, very base level of support when you're unemployed. Other countries have a concept of unemployment insurance, where you get a certain percentage of your last income. And the thing is that difference can be quite large. And so people are having to sort of, in these very difficult times, are having to put away a lot more money in the form of precautionary savings. If there's no vaccination on the horizon, if there's still uncertainty in the market, that precautionary savings motive will certainly still be there in people's behavior. So I think that is going to be problematic, because if they're saving, they're not spending. That means fewer trips to the restaurant, fewer trips to see the hairdresser, et cetera, et cetera. And given that services is the vast majority of our economy, it's not manufacturing. That's going to play a role, and it's not going to be good. So we have to make sure that we reintroduce economic certainty and security. And I'm really hoping that the federal government continues to provide support in terms of programs. I think that will be really, really beneficial. Perceptions matter. It's not just the cold hard number, but perceptions matter in addition to that.
Yeah, I think it's a very hard question to answer, given, first of all, the sort of physical uncertainty around sort of the health outcomes that will occur over the next 12 months.
Yeah.
It is exactly as you've said, going to be primarily driven by how the government responds and how customers and citizens perceive that response. We're going to continue to play the role that we've always played, which is to be there to support the customers and community as best we can. And we'll adapt to whatever the circumstances are. At the moment, we're providing consumers with tools and services in-app and in-branch to really help them manage through the current state of the crisis. And we'll adapt and evolve as we need to. Our objective will be to ensure that financial well-being, if it is impacted negatively, is impacted as little as possible, and that when there is stability, that we are helping consumers get back on track to improving their well-being as quickly as we can.
And I think the thing that really exemplifies the work that we've done together with CBAs, we have a measure now to be tracking that. And we can see as it goes up and as it goes down. And if it goes down, we want to be active in supporting people. But we now have a measure with which we can actually track people.
Excellent, excellent. So there is one final question that is really, hopefully it's a short answer. So John, in your first graph, you showed the financial well-being and how it had ticked up substantially since March.
Yeah.
The scale of that was between 47 and 49.
Yeah.
And so the question is, what's the kind of economic or significance of that scale going up by 1 or 2 points?
Well, of course, all of that is looking at in relation to the series itself. So I'll just sort of pop it up and see if I can.
We are just about out of time.
Yeah.
So if it's really kind of, should we think of a 1 point adjustment as being a really big change, or just a
given the movements in the last 2 years, actually it is a large change. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think you want to unshare. Okay, excellent. So I do see some more questions have come in, but unfortunately we are out of time. Those questions will be answered online, as will the video recording will be made available online. So let me first thank our speakers, John and Mo, and we'll mention that in the chat section of Zoom, as well as you will be sent an email with information on the financial well-being scales. So you will be, you can actually use those scales, and I think CBA and the Institute have been very good in terms of developing a set of scales that they want to have broadly used. I hope you've enjoyed this colloquium, and I look forward to seeing you at our next colloquium on October 27th, where we will have Professor Roger Wilkins and Dr. Esperanza Vera Toscano from the Institute presenting work that has been undertaken on a project funded by the Paul Ramsey Foundation on the topic of entrenched disadvantage. The focus of Rogers and Esperanza's talk will be on intergenerational disadvantage and is titled, "Does Poverty in Childhood Beget Poverty in Adult in Australia?" So you can register for our next colloquia by following the link that will have also been posted in the chat function or posted next to the live stream on Slido. Again, thank you very much. Thank you to our speakers, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks.
Thank you.